The following presentation was recorded by View Digital Media at the inaugural Southeast Linux Fest in Clemson, South Carolina on June 13, 2009. For more information about the Southeast Linux Fest, visit southeastlinuxfest.org.
Thanks very much. It's good to be here. The session should be interactive. We don't have a lot of people here, and there are sometimes questions that people have that they don't get around to asking if they wait till the end. So I've never been a big fan of waiting till the end. So just ask me. We can make it very conversational. The whole notion is to have you understand some of the key issues around patents as they relate to the Linux community, the open source community at large, open source as a modality for invention, and the success of Linux as it marches from the back office transaction processing. A lot of what the public, the uninitiated public, doesn't see, to places like the G phone and other environments, Ubuntu, where it's certainly much more visible from the public standpoint. So for an agenda, will essentially be, we'll just kind of talk about the context of how there's a secondary market that's been created for patenting and how that secondary market has emerged and what it means in terms of the rise of trolls, how their activity has become actually much more virulent over the last 5 to 7 years, some of the leading trolls, some of the activities they've been involved in vis-a-vis Linux, how those activities have been addressed by the community, some of the things that are happening in traditional patent companies that also have impact on how intellectual property, intellectual asset management, rights management should and could occur in the Linux community. I think there's a little bit of a merger of interest there, and while we start out, the community, the open source community, certainly starts out extremely antagonistic toward the notion of patenting. I think there are activities short of patenting that can be quite beneficial. I'll talk about those. And I'll talk a little bit about what we're doing at Open Invention Network to be able to ensure that patents don't create have a negative impact on the ecosystem and on the migration that I talked about earlier from the back office to more visible application environments that people get very emotional about, such as the desktop and the portable devices that are an extension, increasingly an extension of the desktop. Yeah, I think everybody understands the benefits of open source and Linux. I think we've got much more opportunity for innovation. There's some good articles actually in last week's, or just the week that just ended or is ending today, based on when they published. The Economist did a special section on innovation and how open source and Linux is creating new dynamics and more iterative innovation that's more cost effective, yields higher levels of innovation, and is iterative so that it creates higher levels of thought around common problems in terms of applications of services. The key for me is that when I took on this responsibility about 15, 16 months ago, I've had a varied background. I was a diplomat and worked on intellectual property rights issues for the State Department, negotiating agreements all throughout Asia. I've also worked as a consultant, worked in private equity, run a fund focused on lending against intellectual property as an asset class, a naked asset, so that it was its own source of collateral. And then coming to this after a rather varied background in intellectual property law and business, I looked at this situation and thought this is truly an opportunity to leave a mark quietly, but to leave a mark nonetheless. One of the key features about my stewardship of Open Invention Network is that the goal is to work on the periphery of the community and not to invade in the wonderfully elegant, self-organizing, self-regulating nature of what the ecosystem really is. So we work on the periphery to ensure that patents don't have an impact insofar as we can. utilizing creativity, capital, and an experienced team that understands patenting and understands the challenges associated with litigation related to patenting in the current regulatory environment. For me, the real appeal of Linux is that it is it represents a modality for invention more so than it does for a technology in the way I view it, and because of its positioning as the single most significant economically powerful open source initiative, that to a real extent every other initiative, whether it be parallel or serially behind, actually is in the slipstream of Linux. They don't necessarily live and die by Linux, but Linux is extremely important in how open source ultimately is received, the receptivity in the community, the attraction of capital, private equity. I just spoke at a venture capital conference in San Francisco last week, talking to VCs about the importance of investing in open source companies broadly and in Linux companies specifically. Some get it, some are starting to get it, because they've typically looked at intellectual property as the critical component. They want that differentiation. And what I'm explaining to them is that it's really an environment which is open and closed. It's not open or closed, and you have to really understand that we're just going higher up in the stack in a collaborative environment before we get to layering on any kind of proprietary applications, if those are going to be layered on as part of a business model. From right to left, this is all just kind of creating a visual view of what I just described. I think this is the great thing about open source is from the early proselytization from the 60s and onward, it's made eminent sense that if you look at how wireless technology evolved during the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and into the 90s, we wasted an incredible amount of money, and we have lagged behind not only nationally but globally. There's been a lag compared to where the technology was good enough to actually be implemented 7 to 10 years before it actually was rolled out. The U.S., of course, because we waited for CDMA, was another 2 years behind that. So one of the things I see is this incredible kind of starburst model of invention that ultimately yields new levels of value, where the siloed invention that we did in the former days, where Company A, Company B, Company C were involved in inventing discreetly, and then basically having to cross-license each other after usually months, if not years, of battling over patent rights. Obviously thwarted the ability of users to experience the benefits, and for the macroeconomy to see the benefits of technology diffusion. And I think one of the great things about open source is that it creates connection points for people around the globe. I was at the OECD about a month ago in Paris and spoke to them about the whole notion of how this is one of the best, if not the best, aid program that anybody could possibly create. And the great thing about it is it's not designed as an aid program. Obviously, it's an unintended consequence that it creates engagement for the smartest and the best and the brightest, the most creative people around the world to be able to participate, and for capital, for those people not to have to migrate, as most of the VCs in the world are continuing to expect, migrating to Silicon Valley or to Route 128 or to RTP or other places around the world that are technology centers, but rather for capital to flow to innovation where it resides, so it's invention in place rather than creating the dislocation that invention has required, and because of the hegemony of capital in very few countries around the world. And I think this is one of the important byproducts of this process, which is incredibly appealing to me because of my early career as a diplomat and my goal of wanting to see development more broadly diffused, and people who are extremely bright and talented in places around the world that I've traveled and worked, to see those people actually engage around this wonderfully elegant platform. technology and the whole notion of kind of parsing out your intangible assets has been something that, while we don't value assets on the balance sheet yet, we ultimately will. As an aside, Brookings Institute did a study in 1970 and then redid the study in 2000, and then it was updated by another firm about 3 or 4 years ago, and looked at the relative component value in a company based on looking at its market cap and disaggregating it and seeing what was related to hard assets and what was related to intangibles. It was basically 20% intangibles in 1970 and 80% hard assets. When they redid the study in 2000, they found it had completely flip-flopped. So 80% of the value is in intangibles and 20% was in hard assets. And I think in the G8 countries, the G10 countries, that's increasingly the case as we move to an advanced service economy where intellectual capital is the single most significant source of value that can be contributed. And as a result, we've moved toward an environment where intellectual property, as a codified form of intellectual capital has actually become far more significant and important in terms of the value of a company. When companies are acquired or when assets are sold off, there's a lot more clarity and focus on intangibles than there ever was historically. And so with that, you have, again, VCs with an acute focus on intellectual property as a source of differentiation. You've had a history of large and small companies inventing and codifying their inventions in the form of patents, trademarks, and copyrights, please.
My understanding is that mathematical algorithms are not eligible for patents. At what point does the patent office or the government or people involved recognize that programs as algorithms plus data structures and say these shouldn't be patented either? What's it going to take to make the real leap?
Yeah, actually algorithms, if you look at security software, one of the reasons you don't see algorithms is that they stay as trade secrets, but there are some algorithms that have actually been patented. They've been wrapped with other components similar to what you're describing. I think it's just a comment. We're supported by a bunch of very large companies, IBM among them, Novell, Sony, Red Hat, companies that are, they may patent something purely to open source it, like Red Hat, or they may patent it and actually have very successful licensing programs like IBM. I think one of the challenges for the regulators and the legislators right now who are creating what the regulatory roadmap will be is figuring out what should be patented, what shouldn't be patented. We kind of we're in a position where we look at what is, and we're less involved in remaking the future other than giving community members tools so that patents, no matter what the disposition is, whether it's the British Patent Office's view or the European Patent Office's view in Munich or the US Patent Office's view or JPO's view in Japan, whatever happens there, what we're trying to do is develop tools for the community to be proactive in codifying what it knows in an acceptable form that is not patentable, a non-patent-like intellectual property asset. And what that does, the double E community typically has had a certain discipline around the engineering notebook, probably because they're socialized in large companies for the most part as they grow up in codifying everything they have, and they have these engineering notebooks. In a computer science environment, both academically and professionally, there's less of that culture. And I think one of the things that the double E community in general has benefited from is that culture, because a lot of what they have, they can invent in creative ways to ensure that no one can ever patent on top of them. So I'm looking at it a little bit different way, rather than kind of, being another voice in Washington to say, oh, we need to do this or we need to do that, in terms of patent reform. I'm looking at it and saying, regardless of what they do, they're not going to get it 100% right. It just doesn't. Legislative process is about compromise. You're not going to get what everybody wants, especially when you've got the competing interests of the electronics, telecommunications industry, and communications industry in general, and you've got the other path that's pursued by the pharmaceutical industry, which is also a heavy patent environment. And so, in that situation, I'd rather work with the community to give them tools to protect themselves, regardless of what the policy is. That's just the approach we take. Patent offices have granted software patents. You think that, based on the rhetoric, that there aren't software patents in Europe? That's not the case. When you look closely, there are lots of software patents in Europe. Nowhere as near as many as there are in the U.S., but be that as may, it is a problem that actually is somewhat widespread. A reality of what we deal with every day is that there are certain companies, Microsoft in the example I've used here, whose behaviors, attitudes, their DNA is diametrically opposed to seeing open source as a model prevail and Linux as a particular instantiation of open source prevail, as it's obviously very threatening to the franchise. The franchise is where they make all their money. Not all, but most. They may generate a lot of revenue in some of the new areas that they've grown over the last 5 years, 10 years, but real profit comes from the franchise. And Ubuntu and other open source applications are extremely threatening to the core franchise and to the not so successful part of the franchise in the wireless space. 7 has another version coming out. There's another version of CE coming out in that family of wireless apps. They have their own device coming out in January on the Verizon network, which I think will be, by my count, the 4th hardware device that they'll have attempted to introduce. The approach that they're taking now is multi-pronged. If you're a small company, you'll get a visitation. That'll often be, you'll get a call one day, you'll get a visit the next day as evidence of the importance of this particular visit, which is essentially what would be termed in patent jargon a assertion, where they'll talk about their patents in very general terms and then come in and visit the company and be very demonstrative about how that company, these are companies, small companies, I'm talking about companies with as little as $750,000 to $1 million in gross revenue per year, not profit. These are companies that are not terribly successful, web hosting companies. There are a variety of web hosting companies that run Linux who have been approached. And they're encouraged to sign an NDA, which you should never sign an NDA. You should get legal counsel if you're approached by anyone who's asserting their patents, in particular if it's Microsoft. What we're trying to do is educate people to what their rights are, and it's very difficult because you've got a multi-billion-dollar behemoth that's standing across the desk from you in a nice shiny suit that's telling you that you're in violation of their patents and that they have patents that are relevant to Linux, and that if you want to continue to run Linux, you're going to have to take a license from them or they're going to put you out of business. In point of fact, they don't put people out of business. They like to huff and puff, but it is a rather insidious approach that they take overall. That's one aspect. Other companies that are major customers, where they have very good relationships because they have multiple seats of Windows, they'll go to those companies and they'll talk to them about the idea of partnership and how they have these patents that read on Linux, and they know that the company A is also, in addition to their Microsoft seats, are also using Linux in a variety of application areas and increasingly using Linux, and hate to see that there would be problems developed between such a long-standing partner. And that you should really take a license. And by the way, to make it easy, we'll subsidize the license. We'll just reduce your per seat cost for the next 2 years, and we'll call it a specific license. And you'll sign a license agreement, and there'll be specific patents that you're taking a license to. This is part of their totem building strategy. This all is what I'm describing is what I've characterized as a totem building strategy. no one in any of the situations that I'll describe looks at the patents. That's not what this is about. This is a form of, well, it's a encouragement or discouragement from non-conforming behavior that they are very skilled in bringing forward. Right now, they just did a tour of Japan and Korea. You may have noticed that LG took one of these licenses that says now they're safe for Linux because they've taken a license from Microsoft. Microsoft, no doubt, needed some of the patents that LG has in the wireless space, in the device space, and in the display space, and basically hoodwinked them into taking a license to these very valuable Linux patents in return for gaining access to patents that actually LG had, which are far more valuable than the Linux patents that are being hawked. The whole notion is you take the fat patents, just like they did in the TomTom case, you wrap them with the 4 or 5 other, 10 other patents that look like they might read on the, and maybe they are reads, on core activities and applications of the individual company you're targeting, and then you attempt to create a situation which I'll just run through the math for you so understand how this works when you're on the receiving end. TomTom was in a situation where an international ITC action was filed, which cost you anywhere from $8 to $10 million to defend. No ifs, ands, or buts about it. It's at least $8 to $10 million, always. Everything's on an accelerated time schedule, and the real risk is injunction. So you can't afford to be enjoined when the setting. TomTom's like Kleenex in the nav space, more so than how we view Garmin here. TomTom, you're going to TomTom something. It's like Google set the tone, and other players have followed it, and the community, whenever you're in Britain or you're in the Netherlands or in other countries in Europe, if they want to find something a location that you're trying to find that they don't know offhand, they'll say they'll TomTom it, and that's what they do. They have 62% market share, wonderful access to the market, a market that Microsoft covets. Microsoft approached them in a very passive way, had no active discussions or negotiations, and then they received a note in, I guess it was February of this year, maybe it was March, that they were being sued, and then we worked with them. They had very good counsel work with them, and the settlement was that you either settle for something which is not material for reporting purposes from a Netherlands or Holland-based publicly traded market standard, and so it's in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. You either sign up and we can put you on the totem, or it's going to cost you $8 to $10 million to defend the first ITC action we brought, and then the suit that we filed in Western Washington is going to cost you another $5 million, $3.5 to $5 million to defend. So when you're faced with capitulating and allowing them to do the press release, which is really part and parcel of that's what they want. They want to control the press release. This is the inner workings of how this all plays out. So when you read a press release, the LG's press release, LG didn't do anything on the press release. They just looked at it and said, yeah, we coordinated on it. But the key was for every one of these totems that they have is ultimately they're building these totems. They're going to erect them, and for the team picture in Redmond, and then they're going to say, well, look at all these companies that have taken a license. These companies, they've got really kind of expensive IP talent around them. They've got long experience in intellectual property development. All these companies can't be wrong, and they're essentially creating the rebuttable presumption that everyone has to take a license because their position is so relevant in the market. Again, no one ever looks at the patents. We're looking at the patents. And we're inviting the community to participate in looking at those patents. Every time they show a patent, it'll be up on something that we have in the Linux Defenders, which is post-issue period of patent. Patents that are of low quality, that shouldn't be out in the marketplace, that we want to invalidate. We want crowdsourcing. We want the community to participate, identify prior art so that we can request re-exams and have those patents eliminated from take another arrow out of the quiver of companies. Again, it's a category of companies, and Microsoft is used as the most significant because it's the largest and the most threatened by what Linux represents. But the whole notion is to look for bad patents that are held by antagonistic companies that represent a source of irritant to the Linux community. The key thing is that the open source community is so much more mature than it was 5, 6, 7 years ago. SCO was a mild it was a significant episode, but in retrospect, if you put SCO in the context of today, SCO would be managed very easily without kind of creating the gross fear, uncertainty, and doubt that Microsoft lives on. So I think those days are really gone, and it's an attitudinal thing as well as a sense of maturity and the fact that players have come into the community who are helping to navigate. It's not just OIN, it's Free Software Foundation Europe, it's SFLC, and it's also the Linux Foundation. There are a variety of players that have come together with capital and with commitments of large, mid-sized and small companies and developers, the individual developer, representing their interests to make sure that the market develops in the way the market's going to develop without putting fingerprints on it and saying it needs to go this way. That's why first, off the bat, I want to make sure that everybody understands I'm not hawking for the 6 companies that actually have funded the fund that I manage. The activities that I'm involved in, they have a board which aids in guiding my activities. But we have autonomy to use capital to make a difference, to do what's necessary to ensure that Linux is free and open and that it can develop as the community sees appropriate. That's the great thing about it. It's not one company dictating how the community is going to develop or how a technology or an application is going to develop. We kind of view it as a point. We're kind of past the point where Microsoft or others who are antithetical to true innovation and would like to have us be suborned to and relegated to the levels of incremental innovation that they dole out periodically. In order to be positioned well, in order for them to be successful in accomplishing what they'd like to accomplish, which is to slow or stall, the day is gone. The horse is out of the barn, and it's miles away from where they're able to track it down. And one of the key things is the reasons for that is it's a social phenomenon as much as it is a technologically development approach or anything else. People collaborating together, creating creating higher forms of value by thinking together. It's the idea of 1 + 1 = 3 or 5 or 10, but it doesn't equal 2 anymore when you work together in a collaborative environment in open source and Linux. And that phenomenon is so powerful that it seized the attention of people in Washington, in the new administration and former administrations, as well as people in the European Commission, people in JPO, people in India, Brazil, China. Everywhere around the world, people recognize the value of open source and the value of Linux, and the irritants that Microsoft and other operational kind of initiatives that they have underway are simply that, and that's why we're here, and that's why some of those other organizations are around, is to make sure that we're able to broadcast and narrowcast the message. I view myself as someone who has to proselytize the importance of community participation, and I'll talk about some of the programs that I think the community can participate in. Yes?
You got a phrase up there that says antithetical to true innovation.
Discontinuous innovation.
Well, I'd like to challenge that too, because I think Microsoft is all in favor of discontinuous innovation when they control it. I do a lot of work with open innovation in big companies. And one of the things that we ask them to do is draw what we call a Friday diagram. So we work with Michelin, for example.
Mm-hmm.
And in the center of that are the things that are the most strategic to them. In their case, it's literally their secret sauce, rubber. They don't talk to anybody about it. And if you were to challenge Michelin there, they'd act just like Microsoft. Outside that circle are things that are still strategic to them, molding, but they may not be the best in the world. So a little bit more willing to be open, but they're going to be attorneys involved. And then most everything else is things that they're very comfortable, environmental standards. Quite frankly, they want to find an expert. They don't want to do it themselves. And so they're willing to be open in a way you talk about in things that aren't a part of that core. And I agree with pretty much how you said going about the approach, but I think it's important when you think about a company to kind of understand why they react in the way they are. I mean, if you poke them in the core there, they're going to fight back, and that's what Microsoft's doing. And yet at the same time they can be very defensive there, they can actually be very open in other places. And the more you kind of understand where they're willing to be open and where they're willing to fight.
I think they need to be open where Apple needs to be open. Apple needs to be open at the edge to get tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of developers around their platforms. But my view is that yeah. Well, the culture is more closed. But they are open in that respect because application development needs to be, innovation happens at the edge. It doesn't happen at the core, whether it's Michelin, whether it's Bridgestone, or any other company. You get 500 people in a company, and you've already started to move away from the kinds of discontinuous innovation that creates new market or radically redefines existing ones. That's what I'm looking for, is those opportunities. And that's why in university education, if you think you're going to find the edge of what's happening in business management at Harvard, you're not. It's the places that they draw ideas from, because the edge of whenever you get to the center, you lose the opportunity for, this is kind of a separate discussion on it's that same form, it's the same diagram that was used at Tuck about 35 to 40 years ago as to describe starburst models of innovation. And that's what, I mean, actually the CTO at Microsoft understands this very well, because it's like an absolutely worthless company. Lotus is absolutely worthless. You could have just you pay the power bill, that's about it. Because 123 had been run down by Microsoft like a tank in the early 90s. The only thing they had left were 13 entities that they set up outside that were all managed, designed by Jim Manzi and managed by Ray Ozzie. One of them happened to be Notes. They got $4 billion for a company that otherwise would have been worthless through only 3.5 years of development. That's the starburst model of organization writ large. Thermo Electron, there are a whole bunch of other companies that use it because you can't innovate at the levels you want to inside companies. But it's a little bit of a divergence, but I'm more than happy to talk about innovation strategy offline. Dataturn, this is a suit that was brought last April 21st, was settled in about 10, 12 weeks by the defendant. In this case was Red Hat and 25 of its closest and largest customers. One of the things that's happening is that as Linux is becoming more prevalent in large, deep-pocketed users, that trolls have become attracted to the opportunity space. Trolls are companies who are generally non-practicing entities. Sometimes they're formally practicing entities. Companies who, we think about a company like Qualcomm as being very successful. Clearly they developed a standard. The government facilitated them actually being the adopted standard. But in point of fact, they're a failure as an operating company. Their operational strategy was to be a hardware maker that also did licensing. They got out of that business because they recognize they're not good at it. So in some sense, they're a formerly practicing entity that's utilizing their patent portfolio creatively to be able to support technology development. And they do reinvest in technology development. But more traditional trolls are, Amphion is the owner of Dataturn. They picked up Dataturn and had been looking to leverage the intellectual property assets. They filed suit against Red Hat, B of A whole series of banks and travel-related entities, online and brick and mortar, and they ultimately put forward a program designed to whatever word you want to use. Litigation avoidance is really what litigation cost avoidance is really what a troll is about. They know it costs you between $3.5 and $5 million to defend a suit, to take it to term, to jury. And if they can settle, like one of the leading trolls is Acacia. Acacia right now has 36 active lawsuits going concurrently against different defendants. It buys patents or co-ops owners, assignees of patents, owners of patents, to get into a fee-splitting arrangement and manages through a series of contingency lawyer and analyst relationships a network of individuals, and they bring suit. That's their business. They do no technology development. They purely flip patents for the purpose of creating revenue for their shareholders. They're a publicly traded company based in California. And they have a suit against, which is application related. It's not really a Linux suit, but it's against Red Hat as well. There are a series of these suits that really are not salient to the kernel, but they deal with core applications that are maybe uniquely enabled by the kernel, by Linux. They're not of grave concern other than that they represent an annoyance and they mislead people like Jamie Dimon, who has a rather significant network. Jamie Dimon runs JP Morgan Chase. If it's going to discourage him, he's a guy that reads the headlines. He doesn't read below the headline. He gets his information from his people on a lot of areas, or he picks up the phone if he wants to know about something and can access pretty much anybody. But if he's not going to stroke, if he's going to hesitate on a $10 million check for an install of Linux to upgrade some aspect of their network operations, because he's concerned that Linux is, there are a lot of lawsuits related to Linux, it's not the reality, it's the perception of reality that we have to be concerned about as well. At least in my position I am. So one of the things I look to do is interdict troll behavior by getting in front of them. We have several lawsuits that we have staved off by working with trolls and either identifying significant prior art in the patents they were going to assert so that they went back and reconsidered their position, or we've negotiated agreements at very modest terms to take patents off the table that otherwise would have been used for these what I'll consider one thin claim lawsuits, because that's about all you need to actually sustain a lawsuit sufficient to get your payoff. Acacia settlements are averaged from $700,000 to $1.3 million. Because it represents an avoidance of going forward with litigation. You actually save money by succumbing to their extortionate practices. And so this is something that the patent reform is looking to address, and all of the companies that are represented as the investors in OIN and hundreds of other companies have real concerns with the impact on innovation and the cost effectiveness of or the cost detriment that is yielded by the continued proliferation of troll models. Amphion, as I said earlier, Acacia I described. Rembrandt is a very focused troll. They buy all their portfolios and they do maybe 2 or 3 litigation actions a year. They're generally a lot more thorough than the other two. And then Intellectual Ventures has for those of you not aware, I have them in parens because it's not clear that they are a troll They have not asserted and litigated against anyone. They've asserted, actually, they haven't litigated, which is basically bringing their patents out and saying that you're going to need our patents to continue to run your business. But they haven't litigated. But they have gathered since 2000 when they formed. They've invested over $4 billion. They have, well, they haven't invested over $4 billion. They have still some of that capital, but they raised $4 billion and they've acquired 24,900 patents by last count, which is a very significant number of patents. They have 4 funds. Yeah.
They lobby well, each company?
Excuse me?
They lobby well?
Intellectual Ventures is very interesting. It's Nathan Myhrvold, who used to be the CTO of Microsoft, who is a friend of Bill, not so much a friend of the current administration, but he and Bill were thick as thieves and really support the whole idea of innovation at a high level. I think, to your point, they were. I mean, you can't get away from the fact that if it were not for Microsoft, we would not be where we are with personal computing. I mean, a major innovation was stewarded by that company. The problem is when you're a monopolist, you act as a monopolist, and when you have no role models, it's very difficult to have any expectation. If your only role model is a company that basically had us flying around in technology that was 30 years old until the Europeans got together and decided to do something about it, it just doesn't make for a great environment. I mean, as independent and fiercer competitors John Chambers is at Cisco, the legacy of Hewlett and Packard and the appropriateness of a model of operation of a business was laid out by Hewlett and Packard as well as by Varian early on in the Valley. And there was a certain code and a certain kind of social compact of appropriate behavior. Even Larry Ellison, in his better days, understands that code very, very well. In fact, he's a student of that code. But I think the key here is what will happen. We don't know, but I think it bears watching because they have a very significant storehouse of patents. And in response, defensive patent pools have arisen, and these patent pools you can expect to work together in the future because it's all about dealing with the billions of dollars that have been raised on the other side. In some sense, it's a very inefficient process because on the one side you've got corporate troll activity, as I've described from Microsoft, and traditional, what has become traditional non-practicing entity troll activity. On the other side, if you've got OIN in a very focused defensive patent pool, again with our acute focus on Linux, and then Allied Security Trust, their first fund, and RPX. Each of them each entity has different ways of proceeding. We don't generate any profit. We don't generate any revenue. We don't break even. We don't attempt to break even. Ours is this is a mission to ensure that there's a level playing field and that open source and Linux survives. Allied Security Trust represents the interests of a select group of companies. RPX represents the interests of a select group of companies as well, but they're acutely focused on generating profit. But nonetheless, because they have in their bylaws the inability to assert and litigate, they're someone that can be worked with. They tend to buy patents that are of lower quality, not always, but generally ones that are troll bait, that trolls would love to have because they represent potentially large settlement opportunities or many, many suit opportunities. Clearly, what's going on in the patent world is skip ahead to this. From two sides, there's a bit of convergence. Large companies, IBM, Philips of the Netherlands, Motorola, Nokia, Siemens, Ericsson, all those companies have independently come to the conclusion that just patenting for patenting's sake is no longer the way forward. And what they've started to do is reduce the number of patent applications that they file and start to increase the number of defensive publications. Defensive publications are in some sense an anti-patent for the open source community, and in another sense, for a large company that is seeking to grow a patent portfolio, it's a far more cost-effective way of ensuring that you're practicing appropriate intellectual property rights management. The patents, when you have a really good patent, you want to wrap it with, the reason why you develop all these other patents is you're building a family. The family is essentially protecting, there are all these child patents around this core, but you're protecting the patent from being attacked, having its core claims attacked and being weakened by third parties who come later with other inventions that look at the extensions of the core claims. And in this situation, you've got, I just couldn't see the two, sorry. In this situation, you have a combination of patenting and defensive publications. You've got the core patent, you wrap it with defensive publications, which are not things that can restrict people's behaviors, other companies' behaviors. They're essentially statements that are very much like, they don't have claims, but they're very much like a patent. They would otherwise be patentable, except they don't have claims. But the interesting thing about them, and why I think they're particularly relevant to the open source community, is because these defensive publications can never be used to restrict the behaviors of others, but they do represent prior art. So if we get the community, if all the developers in the community would start to codify what they know and what they've invented, we wouldn't have 3 or 4 or 5 years later someone inventing the same thing that they invented and then having everybody be upset and think that the patent system stinks. Yeah.
So publishing the code that does what the defensive publication describes, is that not enough?
Well, where are you going to publish it, though?
Well, working code that ships.
Yeah, it's not enough because the key piece that's missing is that it's not accessible to patent and trademark office examiners. So the patent examiner has to find it. And we can't rely on Google. No matter how evolved Google gets, and I know Christabone is here, we're not going to get there because this is something that's extremely challenging. You've got to basically deliver it on a platter. There's something called IP.com. We bear all the costs of the creation of these defensive publications. We're inviting the community in to participate. I'm running out of time, but essentially this program at the bottom, Linux Defenders, is one of the things I want to emphasize today, is that we're looking at poor quality applications to eliminate those through peer-to-patent. That's what that's about. Go to the website and look at it if you get a chance. Post-issue peer-to-patent, as I described earlier, bad patents that have already been granted, we want to eliminate those, so we need the crowdsourcing support to identify prior art, contribute it. We'll make sure that it's useful in defeating these patents, in invalidating patents that exist. Defensive publications, essentially what I'm just describing. If we codified what we knew, then we'd get so much prior art that we wouldn't get people getting patents on things that are well known. Yes?
Why can't the Linux community go the route of BSD and just identify all the disputed code and replace it with completely new code that's not based on any of the disputed patents?
Chase your tail forever.
Yeah.
Chase your tail forever.
I think there's just, rather than kind of get wrapped around the axle about that question, BSD comes up all the time in discussions, particularly in Europe, but it's not something, if you could go back to the beginning, that's different, but you can't kind of, in midstream, go back and do that efficiently. So these are essentially the programs. These slides will be available for people who want access to them. What we're trying to provide is freedom of action and freedom to operate. And that's why we're trying to get the community mobilized to actually codify its inventions in a socially acceptable way by the community's ethic. And that's what defensive publications represent. And again, it's the whole idea of 1 + 1 does not equal just 2. But by working together, we can deal with these patent issues, and we can also deal with some of the broader issues of where Linux is going. If you don't have to worry about patent issues, which is what we're trying to do, we think the community is going to be much healthier in terms of developing its own kind of shadow roadmap of where it needs to go in some of the key areas. So anyway, part of what I'm proposing is market-led patent reform. Let's not let legislators and regulators and the judiciary try and solve the problem themselves. If we participate by utilizing defensive publications and utilizing these other tools under Linux Defenders, we're going to be in a lot better position than we are right now. And that's my mobile number. Anyone, anytime, should feel free to call me, no matter where they are in the world. I listen to people. You know, we have something called Linux Defenders 911, and we take it very seriously. We get a lot of good leads about lawsuits or people who are being bothered in patent issues. We want to be as immersed in the community as we can, given the fact that we live on its border, patrolling the border to make sure patents don't affect the way of life of people who are contributing to this incredibly vital community. Thank you very much for your time.
This work was recorded by View Digital Media and is licensed under a Creative Commons Attribution, Share-alike version 3.0. For more information about the Southeast Linux Fest, visit southeastlinuxfest.org.